Before the United States became a constitutional republic, before it had a president, a judiciary, or even the power to tax its own citizens, it existed as something far more fragile. The first national government of the United States was not designed to be strong. It was designed to survive fear of tyranny, fear of centralized authority, and fear of repeating the very system Americans had just rebelled against. That government was the Articles of Confederation. To understand why the Articles were written the way they were, it is necessary to understand the mindset of the people who created them. The American Revolution was not merely a war for independence, it was a rejection of concentrated power. Parliament, in the colonial imagination, was not simply a distant legislature. It was an instrument of overreach, taxation without consent, and arbitrary authority. When Americans broke away from Britain, they did not dream of replacing one powerful central government with another. They dreamed of freedom guarded by local control. This suspicion shaped every political decision that followed. In the years leading up to independence, the colonies were not united by a shared national identity. They were united by shared grievances. Each colony had its own legislature, its own traditions, its own interests. Loyalty to colony came far more naturally than loyalty to any imagined United States. Even as resistance to Britain intensified, many Americans still believed reconciliation was possible. Independence was not inevitable, it was gradual, reluctant, and deeply contested. The First Continental Congress, convened in 1774, was not a government. It was a meeting. Its purpose was not to rule, but to coordinate resistance. Delegates arrived hoping to persuade Parliament to reconsider its policies, not to declare independence. Even the most radical voices still spoke the language of rights within the empire, not separation from it. That hope collapsed quickly. When fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord, the colonies were forced to confront a reality they had tried to avoid. War demanded coordination. Armies needed supplies. Diplomacy required unity. Yet there was no national authority empowered to command obedience. The Second Continental Congress improvised. It raised an army, appointed George Washington as commander, issued currency, and negotiated abroad, all without formal constitutional authority. This improvisation worked just well enough to keep the revolution alive. But it also terrified many delegates. Congress had assumed enormous powers without legal foundation. If independence were achieved, what would stop this temporary wartime body from becoming a permanent tyrant? The same men who feared British authority now feared their own creation. This fear shaped the earliest discussions of a national framework. Ideas for colonial union had existed long before the Revolution. Benjamin Franklin had proposed plans for intercolonial cooperation as early as the 1750s. These plans shared a common flaw in colonial eyes. They asked colonies to give up power. Time and again, colonial legislatures rejected them. Local autonomy was non-negotiable. By 1776, independence forced the issue. Once the colonies declared themselves sovereign states, they needed something to bind them together. War could not be fought by 13 independent nations acting alone. Treaties could not be signed by a loose association. Congress needed legitimacy, but the states were unwilling to surrender authority. The solution was compromise through weakness. The Articles of Confederation were conceived not as a national government, but as a league of friendship. Sovereignty would remain with the states. Congress would exist, but only as a coordinating body. It would have responsibilities, but almost no power to enforce them. John Dickinson, a cautious and thoughtful delegate, was tasked with drafting the initial framework. Though personally uneasy with independence, he understood that some structure was necessary. His early drafts envisioned a stronger central authority than what would ultimately be adopted. Even these modest proposals provoked resistance. As debate intensified, state delegations stripped power from Congress piece by piece. The result was a document that reflected fear more than confidence. Under the Articles, there would be no executive branch, no president, no national judiciary. Congress would consist of a single chamber, where each state had one vote regardless of size or population. Laws required supermajorities. Amendments required unanimous consent. Congress could request money from states, but could not compel payment. It could declare war and make treaties, but could not enforce them. This was not an accident. It was intentional design. The states believed liberty was safest when power was dispersed. They believed tyranny emerged from concentration, not chaos. The Articles reflected a belief that independence itself was the ultimate safeguard, and that cooperation should always remain voluntary. Ratification proved how fragile that belief was. States argued bitterly over land claims, representation, and economic advantage. Some feared stronger neighbors would dominate the Union. Others feared Congress would eventually grow teeth. Maryland refused to ratify for years, demanding that Western lands be placed under national control. The delay nearly paralyzed the new government before it even existed. When the Articles finally took effect in 1781, they governed a nation at war, and exposed their flaws immediately. Congress struggled to fund the Continental Army. It printed money that rapidly lost value. It begged states for supplies that arrived late, or not at all. Soldiers starved while farmers sold goods to the British for reliable currency. Washington watched his army nearly collapse, not because of enemy strength, but because of governmental weakness. Foreign powers noticed. European nations hesitated to fully trust a government that could not enforce its own agreements. Treaties were signed, but compliance depended on state cooperation. When states ignored obligations, Congress could only protest. The Articles had created responsibility without authority. Yet even as failure mounted, many Americans resisted reform. To them, weakness was preferable to tyranny. The memory of Parliament loomed large. Any proposal to strengthen Congress sounded dangerously familiar. Better a government that struggled than one that ruled. This tension, between fear of power and need for effectiveness, defined the Confederation era. The Articles of Confederation were not naive. They were defensive. They represented a people who had won independence by resisting authority, and were not yet ready to trust themselves with it. They assumed virtue would substitute for enforcement. That states would act in the common interest out of shared sacrifice. History would prove otherwise. By the early 1780s, cracks in the system were undeniable. Congress could not pay its debts. It could not protect commerce. It could not ensure unity. Soldiers threatened mutiny. States printed competing currencies. Borders were disputed. Treaties were violated. The Union existed more in name than in function. And yet, without the Articles, there would have been no Constitution. The Confederation failed, but it taught Americans what failure looked like. It clarified the dangers of excessive decentralization. It forced leaders to confront a hard truth: liberty without structure is as dangerous as power without limits. The Articles of Confederation were the United States' first experiment in self-government. They were cautious, fearful, and flawed. But they were also necessary. They carried the nation through revolution and into independence. They bought time. And in that time, Americans learned that freedom required more than resistance, it required responsibility. When the Articles of Confederation formally took effect in 1781, the United States was still fighting for its survival. Victory over Britain was not yet assured, and the war had already stretched the fragile alliance of states to its limits. In theory, the Articles provided the framework necessary to coordinate the war effort. In practice, they revealed how dangerous a government without authority could be. Congress possessed responsibility without power. Under the Articles, Congress could declare war, negotiate treaties, and appoint military officers. It could request troops and money from the states. But it could not compel obedience. Every major function of government relied on voluntary cooperation, and voluntary cooperation proved unreliable when sacrifice was required. The Continental Army suffered the consequences immediately. George Washington's forces were chronically underfunded, underfed, and undersupplied. Congress lacked the authority to levy taxes, so it relied on state contributions that were often late, partial, or non-existent. States prioritized their own militias and local needs. Soldiers went unpaid for months. Supplies rotted in warehouses while frontline units starved. Morale collapsed not because of British strength, but because of domestic paralysis. Washington understood the danger. From his headquarters, he wrote repeatedly to Congress, warning that the army could not survive without reform. He did not argue for dictatorship or unchecked authority. He argued for basic functionality. A government that could not feed its soldiers, he warned, would not long remain a government at all. Congress listened, but could do little. The Articles gave Congress no power to raise revenue directly. Its only tool was persuasion. When persuasion failed, Congress printed paper money. The result was predictable. Inflation spiraled. Currency lost value. Soldiers were paid in money that could not buy food. Civilians refused to accept it. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered the American vocabulary as a synonym for worthlessness. Economic instability spread beyond the army. Each state printed its own currency, set its own trade policies, and regulated commerce independently. There was no national standard. Interstate trade became chaotic. States imposed tariffs on one another. Merchants exploited loopholes. Debts went unpaid. Credit evaporated. The economic unity required for national stability simply did not exist. Foreign governments took notice. France, America's most important ally, grew increasingly frustrated. Loans were extended reluctantly. Diplomats questioned whether Congress could honor its obligations. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade, exploiting Congress's inability to respond forcefully. Britain, despite losing the war, retained military posts in the Northwest, openly defying treaty obligations. Congress protested. Britain ignored it. Under the Articles, protest was the limit of power. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally ended the war and recognized American independence. On paper, the United States had achieved its greatest triumph. In reality, independence exposed the Confederation's deepest weaknesses. War had masked dysfunction through necessity. Peace revealed it mercilessly. Congress now faced tasks that required enforcement. It needed to repay war debts. It needed to regulate trade. It needed to ensure states complied with international agreements. It needed to manage Western lands and prevent interstate conflict. The Articles were not designed for any of this. Every major decision required supermajorities. Amendments required unanimous consent. A single state could, and often did, block reform. Small states feared domination by larger ones. Large states resented equal representation. Regional rivalries intensified. Consensus became nearly impossible. The states behaved like independent nations. They negotiated trade agreements independently. They disputed borders. They competed economically. Loyalty to state governments far outweighed loyalty to Congress. For ordinary Americans, the national government remained distant and abstract. State legislatures were where power felt real. This imbalance produced instability. Veterans returned home to economic hardship and unpaid wages. Farmers struggled with debt. Creditors demanded repayment in hard currency. State governments responded differently, some offering relief, others enforcing strict collection. The lack of national coordination deepened inequality and resentment. The crisis reached a breaking point in 1786. In western Massachusetts, armed farmers led by Daniel Shays rose in rebellion against state courts and tax collectors. They were not seeking revolution, they were demanding relief. They closed courthouses, intimidated officials, and challenged the authority of the state. Congress watched helplessly. Under the Articles, Congress had no standing army and no funds to raise one. It could not intervene. Massachusetts was forced to suppress the rebellion on its own, funded largely by private donors. The message was unmistakable: the national government could not guarantee domestic order. Shays' rebellion terrified political leaders. To some, it confirmed fears that democracy led inevitably to chaos. To others, it demonstrated that the Confederation had failed to provide stability or justice. The rebellion did not cause the collapse of the Articles, but it accelerated the realization that reform was unavoidable. Even those most committed to states' rights began to reconsider. James Madison, once a defender of limited central authority, concluded that the Articles were fundamentally flawed. Alexander Hamilton argued openly that the Confederation was little more than a diplomatic alliance incapable of governing. Even George Washington, who had resisted political involvement, warned that the Union was on the brink of disintegration. Still, resistance to reform remained strong. Many Americans believed the Articles were failing not because they were weak, but because states were selfish. Strengthening Congress, they feared, would repeat the mistakes of British rule. Better to endure inefficiency than risk tyranny. This belief had deep roots and could not be dismissed lightly. Yet the evidence mounted relentlessly. Congress could not raise money. It could not regulate commerce. It could not enforce treaties. It could not protect borders. It could not suppress internal unrest. It could not even guarantee attendance. Delegates frequently failed to appear, leaving Congress without a quorum. The government existed, but barely. The Confederation's greatest strength, its respect for state sovereignty, had become its greatest weakness. The Articles assumed cooperation where competition prevailed. They assumed virtue where self-interest dominated. They assumed unity where fragmentation deepened. By the mid-1780s, it was clear that something had to change. Not because Americans wanted a powerful national government, but because they wanted a functioning one. The challenge was not to abandon liberty, but to preserve it through stability. The Articles had secured independence. They could not secure peace. The question facing the nation was no longer whether the Articles were flawed. It was whether the United States could survive under them. And slowly, reluctantly, a consensus began to form. The Confederation had carried America through revolution. It could not carry it into the future. By the mid-1780s, the failure of the Articles of Confederation was no longer an abstract concern debated only by political elites. It was a lived reality felt across the states. Economic instability, diplomatic weakness, and internal unrest combined to create a sense that the American experiment was drifting toward collapse. The question was no longer whether the Confederation government was flawed. It was whether the United States could survive without fundamentally rethinking its structure. The end of the Revolutionary War had removed the one force holding the states together, a common enemy. During the conflict, necessity had masked dysfunction. Peace stripped away that illusion. Each state now pursued its own interests openly, often at the expense of the Union as a whole. The Articles offered no mechanism to resolve these conflicts, no authority capable of compelling cooperation. Trade disputes became especially corrosive. Without a national power to regulate commerce, states treated one another as foreign competitors. They imposed tariffs, closed ports, and manipulated currencies to gain advantage. New York taxed goods moving up the Hudson River to New Jersey and Connecticut. Virginia and Maryland quarreled over navigation of the Potomac. Merchants faced contradictory regulations that changed at state borders. Economic growth slowed, and resentment grew. Foreign nations exploited the chaos. Britain, though defeated, recognized the Confederation's weakness immediately. It refused to evacuate forts in the Northwest Territory, violating the Treaty of Paris. It restricted American trade with the British West Indies, knowing Congress lacked the authority to negotiate or retaliate effectively. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American commerce, threatening the livelihoods of Western settlers. Congress could protest, but it could not act. Diplomacy without enforcement proved hollow. At home, economic hardship deepened. The war had left enormous debt at both the state and national levels. Congress could not tax. States, burdened by their own obligations, often refused to contribute. Inflation lingered. Credit dried up. Farmers struggled to pay taxes demanded in hard currency. Courts enforced foreclosures. Jails filled with debtors. This tension exploded in Massachusetts. Shays' Rebellion, though small in scale, had outsized impact. Veterans who had fought for independence now found themselves facing imprisonment for unpaid debts. When courts refused relief, armed groups shut them down. They marched not against the idea of government, but against a system they believed had abandoned them. The Confederation government was powerless to respond. Congress lacked both money and troops. Massachusetts raised a privately funded militia to suppress the rebellion. Order was restored, but the lesson was unmistakable. The national government could neither maintain internal stability nor assist states in crisis. If rebellion spread, there would be no coordinated response. For many leaders, this was the breaking point. George Washington, who had hoped to retire permanently from public life, watched events with growing alarm. He feared not only disorder, but disunion. Without reform, he warned, the United States would become a name, a shadow. James Madison reached similar conclusions, arguing that the Articles had created a system incapable of controlling either excess democracy or elite rivalry. Alexander Hamilton was more blunt. Hamilton believed the Confederation was already dead in all but name. He argued that the states would eventually drift apart or fall under foreign influence unless a stronger national government replaced the Articles entirely. To him, amendment was insufficient. The system itself was the problem. Yet reform faced enormous resistance. Many Americans still equated central authority with tyranny. The Revolution was fresh in memory. Any proposal to strengthen Congress triggered suspicion. State legislatures guarded their sovereignty fiercely. Smaller states feared domination by larger ones. Southern states feared interference with slavery. Western settlers feared abandonment. There was no consensus, only shared anxiety. The first serious attempt at reform came in 1786 at the Annapolis Convention. Delegates from several states gathered to discuss trade regulation, the most visible failure of the Confederation. Attendance was sparse. Only 5 states sent representatives. Yet the meeting proved pivotal, not because of what it accomplished, but because of what it acknowledged. The delegates admitted openly that the Articles were inadequate. They issued a call for a broader convention to examine the entire federal system. This was a bold step. It implicitly challenged the legitimacy of the existing framework. It suggested that patchwork reform would not suffice. The nation needed to confront its foundational design. Momentum built slowly. Some states resisted outright. Others hesitated, fearing radical change. But the accumulation of crises made delay increasingly dangerous. Economic stagnation persisted. Interstate conflicts intensified. Foreign disrespect continued. The Confederation's inability to act became undeniable. By 1787, enough states agreed to send delegates to a convention in Philadelphia. Officially, the purpose was limited, to revise the Articles of Confederation. Unofficially, many delegates arrived convinced that revision was impossible. The system, they believed, was fundamentally flawed. The challenge was not to repair it, but to replace it, without provoking public backlash. The stakes were enormous. Any new framework risked rejection by states jealous of their independence. Too much central power could undo the Revolution's legacy. Too little would repeat the Confederation's failure. The delegates faced a paradox. To save liberty, they might have to strengthen authority. The Articles had reached their breaking point. They had succeeded in one crucial task, guiding the colonies through revolution without replacing one tyranny with another. But they failed at the next task, governing a nation in peace. Their structure reflected fear, not confidence. They assumed virtue where self-interest prevailed. They depended on cooperation without providing incentives or enforcement. The Confederation government did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded. Each crisis exposed the weakness. Each failure reinforced doubt. By 1787, few believed the Articles could endure. The question was no longer whether change was necessary, but whether Americans were ready to accept it. The Philadelphia Convention would answer that question. And in doing so, it would redefine the meaning of American government forever. When delegates arrived in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they came burdened by failure. The Articles of Confederation still existed on paper, but few in attendance believed they could be saved. What divided the delegates was not whether the system was broken, but how far they were willing to go to fix it. The convention had been authorized to revise the Articles. Almost immediately, it became clear that revision would not be enough. The Articles had failed not because they were poorly executed, but because they were fundamentally misdesigned. They treated the United States as a loose alliance of sovereign states rather than a single political community. They assumed cooperation where competition prevailed. They gave Congress responsibility without authority. These flaws could not be corrected with minor amendments. They required a new foundation. This realization emerged quickly and controversially. James Madison arrived in Philadelphia better prepared than anyone else. He had spent months studying ancient confederacies and modern republics, searching for lessons in political failure. His conclusion was stark. Confederations inevitably collapsed because they could not enforce national decisions. The Articles, Madison believed, were repeating this historical pattern. Within days, Madison and his allies introduced the Virginia Plan. The plan proposed an entirely new structure of government. Instead of a single legislative body, there would be 2 chambers. Representation would be based on population, not state equality. A national executive would enforce laws. A national judiciary would interpret them. Most radically, the national government would possess authority independent of the states, including the power to tax and regulate commerce. This was not revision. It was replacement. The Virginia plan shocked many delegates. Smaller states immediately objected. Under the Articles, they had enjoyed equal voting power. Under Madison's proposal, populous states like Virginia and Pennsylvania would dominate. Smaller states feared becoming irrelevant, their sovereignty swallowed by a distant authority. William Paterson of New Jersey responded with an alternative. The New Jersey Plan retained the basic structure of the Articles, a single legislative body with equal state representation. It proposed modest expansions of congressional power, including the ability to tax and regulate trade. To its supporters, this approach preserved the spirit of the Confederation while addressing its most obvious weaknesses. The debate exposed the convention's central dilemma. Delegates agreed the Articles were inadequate, but they disagreed on what should replace them. Large states favored national authority. Small states favored state equality. Southern states feared interference with slavery. Northern states feared economic fragmentation. Each delegation arrived with its own anxieties, shaped by local interests and historical memory. Compromise became unavoidable. The Great Compromise, brokered largely by delegates from Connecticut, resolved the most explosive dispute. Congress would be bicameral. The House of Representatives would be based on population. The Senate would grant equal representation to each state. This arrangement preserved state equality in one chamber while acknowledging population in the other. The compromise did more than settle representation. It marked the final break with the Articles. Under the Confederation, Congress was a meeting of states. Under the new system, Congress would be a national legislature representing people and states simultaneously. This dual identity reflected a fundamental shift in political philosophy. Sovereignty would no longer reside exclusively in the states. It would be shared. Other features reinforced this transformation. The new government would have an executive, something the Articles had deliberately avoided. Many delegates feared executive power, associating it with monarchy. But experience under the Articles had demonstrated the danger of leaderless government. Laws without enforcement were suggestions, not commands. The presidency emerged as a compromise between fear and necessity. The executive would be singular, energetic enough to act decisively, but constrained by checks. He would be elected indirectly, limited by term length, subject to impeachment, and balanced by legislative authority. This design reflected lessons learned under the Confederation. Power must exist to function, but must be divided to remain safe. The judiciary completed the framework. Under the Articles, there was no national court system. Disputes between states lingered unresolved. Federal laws lacked consistent interpretation. The new Constitution created a Supreme Court and authorized lower federal courts. Law would no longer depend solely on state enforcement. National authority would have national reach. Perhaps the most significant change concerned taxation. The inability to raise revenue had crippled the Confederation. The new government would possess the power to tax directly. This authority transformed the state from a petitioner into a sovereign entity capable of sustaining itself. It also provoked fear. Taxation was the grievance that had sparked revolution. Granting that power again required trust the Articles had deliberately avoided. To mitigate that fear, the Constitution embedded limits. Representation, elections, separation of powers, and enumerated authority were designed to prevent abuse. The new government would be stronger than the Confederation, but not unlimited. Liberty would be preserved not by weakness, but by structure. This was the central lesson learned from the Articles. Weak government did not guarantee freedom. It invited disorder, injustice, and vulnerability. Liberty required institutions capable of action as well as restraint. The Constitution reflected a shift from revolutionary fear to republican confidence. Yet the decision to abandon the Articles was risky. The delegates exceeded their mandate. They drafted an entirely new system without direct authorization. Ratification would require public approval. Many Americans remained deeply suspicious of centralized power. The memory of British rule lingered. Critics would argue that the convention had betrayed the revolution's principles. The framers understood this danger. They framed the Constitution not as a rejection of liberty, but as its protection. The failures of the Articles became their strongest argument. Without reform, they warned, the Union would collapse. States would drift apart. Foreign powers would exploit division. Internal conflict would escalate. The Articles had demonstrated what happened when fear dictated design. The Constitution represented an attempt to correct that overcorrection. It sought balance between authority and liberty, national power and local autonomy, popular rule and institutional restraint. The Confederation model was deliberately abandoned because it could not evolve. Its requirement of unanimous consent for amendment made reform nearly impossible. Its dependence on state compliance made enforcement unreliable. Its structure treated the Union as temporary rather than permanent. The Constitution treated the United States as a nation. Ratification debates would determine whether Americans were ready to accept that idea. But regardless of the outcome, the Philadelphia Convention marked the end of the Articles of Confederation as a viable system. Their time had passed. They had been necessary, but no longer sufficient. The United States had learned, through experience rather than theory, that independence alone did not create stability. Governance required power, and power required accountability. The Articles had feared power too much to wield it. The Constitution would attempt to wield it carefully. The Confederation era ended not with collapse, but with replacement. And in that replacement lay the future of American government. The Articles of Confederation did not collapse in a dramatic moment. There was no coup, no violent overthrow, no declaration of bankruptcy that ended the first American government. Instead, the Articles faded into obsolescence, replaced quietly by a constitution that acknowledged their failures while borrowing from their intentions. This quiet ending is fitting because the Articles were never meant to dominate American political life. They were meant to restrain it. To judge the Articles solely by what they failed to achieve is to misunderstand why they existed in the first place. The Confederation was born out of revolution, not theory. Its authors were not political idealists experimenting with abstract models of governance. They were revolutionaries traumatized by imperial power. They had seen what centralized authority could do when unchecked. The Articles were their shield against repeating that experience. In this sense, the Confederation was not a mistake, it was a reaction. And reactions, by their nature, often overcorrect. The Articles assumed that liberty was preserved by minimizing power. They treated government as a necessary evil, something to be kept weak, distant, and dependent. Authority was fragmented intentionally. Congress was denied coercive tools not because the authors were naive, but because they were afraid that power, once granted, would never be surrendered. This fear was rational. In the 18th century, strong governments were usually oppressive ones. Kings ruled by decree. Parliaments taxed without consent. Armies enforced obedience. The American Revolution was a rebellion against that world. Expecting the generation that fought it to immediately embrace centralized authority was unrealistic. The Articles represented a bridge between rebellion and governance. They allowed the colonies to coordinate without surrendering sovereignty. They enabled independence without recreating empire. They kept the Union alive long enough for Americans to learn, through experience, what self-government required. That learning process was painful. The Confederation exposed the costs of excessive decentralization. It demonstrated that a government unable to tax cannot govern responsibly. It showed that treaties mean little without enforcement. It revealed that liberty without order breeds insecurity, not freedom. Most importantly, it proved that shared ideals are insufficient substitutes for institutional power. These lessons were not theoretical. They were lived. Farmers lost land. Soldiers went unpaid. Credit collapsed. Foreign powers ignored American diplomacy. States quarreled openly. The Union survived, but barely. And survival alone was not enough. The Constitution did not reject the Articles' principles. It refined them. Federalism, the division of power between national and state governments, was not invented in 1787. It evolved from the Confederation experience. The Constitution preserved state authority while granting national power where it was clearly necessary. This balance was impossible under the Articles, which treated all power as equally dangerous. The Bill of Rights, too, reflects the Confederation's legacy. Many Americans supported the Constitution only after assurances that individual liberties would be explicitly protected. This demand arose directly from fear of centralized authority, the same fear that shaped the Articles. In this way, the Confederation's spirit survived even as its structure was abandoned. The Articles also shaped political culture. They ingrained a deep skepticism of government that remains central to American identity. The belief that power must be watched, questioned, and restrained did not disappear with the Constitution. It became embedded in public discourse. The Confederation era taught Americans to distrust authority, even their own. This distrust has been both a strength and a weakness. It has protected civil liberties and encouraged civic vigilance. It has also fueled resistance to collective solutions and national coordination. Debates over federal power, states' rights, and national authority trace directly back to the Articles' legacy. The questions they raised were never fully settled. The Confederation also influenced how Americans view failure. Unlike many nations, the United States did not treat its first government as sacred. It replaced it. This willingness to revise foundational structures without revolution was extraordinary. It established a precedent for constitutional self-correction that remains rare in world history. The Articles failed, and America learned from that failure. That learning process is perhaps their greatest achievement. Without the Confederation's weaknesses, the Constitution's strengths might never have been identified. Without the inability to tax, the necessity of fiscal power might not have been accepted. Without diplomatic humiliation, national unity might not have been prioritized. Without Shays' Rebellion, the danger of internal disorder might not have been understood. The Articles were a lesson written in practice rather than ink. Modern discussions of American governance often return, consciously or unconsciously, to the same tensions that defined the Confederation era. How strong should the federal government be? Where should power reside? When does authority protect liberty, and when does it threaten it? These are not new questions. They are inherited ones. The Articles of Confederation remind us that freedom is not self-sustaining. It requires institutions capable of enforcing law, resolving conflict, and acting decisively when necessary. At the same time, they remind us that power must be restrained, questioned, and divided to remain legitimate. The Confederation failed because it trusted virtue too much and power too little. The Constitution responded by trusting structure, checks, balances, elections, and law. Neither approach is perfect. Both reflect different fears. The legacy of the Articles is not embarrassment. It is humility. They show that self-government is not achieved in a single moment, but through iteration, error, and adjustment. They prove that founding documents are not sacred because they are flawless, but because they are amendable. The United States did not begin with its strongest government. It began with its most cautious. That caution preserved liberty long enough for Americans to learn how to govern themselves. The Articles of Confederation were the first answer to that challenge. They were incomplete, inadequate, and ultimately replaced, but they were essential. They carried a fragile nation through its most uncertain years. And in doing so, they made the Constitution possible.